The late 1950s were a challenging time in the U.S. as the economy headed into recession, and this recession spilled over into U.S. car makers, who at the time really weren't sure where the buying public was going or what it would buy in the coming years, given the impacts of the aforementioned recession. However, one thing was certain for General Motors leadership, and that was that it had to introduce some smaller vehicles compared to the full-size vehicles it had been producing. Imports were starting to capture a decent amount of share, and in particular, VW's Beetle was captivating the hearts and minds of people, particularly on the West Coast. GM wasn't going to sit idly by and let its market share be gobbled up by import competitors. As such, GM launched the Corvair in the 1960 model year, and for the subsequent model year, so-called senior compacts were going to be introduced, in part based on Corvair's Y-body platform. These vehicles would be introduced by Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac and included the 1961 Tempest, the 1961 Oldsmobile F85 and Cutlass, and the 1961 Buick Special and the top-of-the-line trim, the Skylark. These were to be dramatically different vehicles from the typical body-on-frame full-size cars that General Motors and its customers were used to. All of these vehicles, the Corvair, the Tempest, the F85, and the Special, were to have unitized or unibody construction. In other words, there was no separate frame from the body. They also would share a number of components when it came to sheet metal, including roof lines and side glass. And each of the vehicles was to be endowed with so-called big car performance. General Motors leadership knew that its customers, if they got into a small car, would expect decent levels of performance from these vehicles, as well as ride and handling. The company thus set out to make these small vehicles ride like large cars in terms of their overall ride and handling, and to have good levels of performance with a number of new engines. Of course, the Corvair had an all-new air-cooled inline six-cylinder that sat at the rear of the vehicle. Pontiac had its own trophy four-cylinder, effectively half of a 389 V8 under hood, and used a unique transaxle for the vehicle, where the transmission and torque converter were in the rear of the car. Buick and Oldsmobile had a more conventional front-engine rear drive layout, with the engine and transmission up front and a conventional rear axle out back. But there would be some unique elements associated with this powertrain combination, including the all-new 215 cubic inch aluminum V8 that would be found under hood. When it came to designing the 1961 Special and Skylark, Buick designers wanted to make sure that no one would confuse the Special for anything other than a Buick. The 1961 full-size cars were going to have so-called bullet fenders on either side, a Buick trait that was a new character feature versus the 1959 and 1960 Buicks that frankly didn't sell well, in part because of the recession and in part also because of their polarizing styling. Thus, the 1961 Buicks were to chart a new direction in style with this front end that was unique to Buick in the entire General Motors stable. There were a number of styling changes that the design team under Bernard Smith had to get used to and accommodate for the 1961 Special and Skylark. Similar to the 1959 cars, where all the front doors were patterned off of the Buick design, these 1961 Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac senior compacts also were to share common door sheet metal. This was a bit of a challenge because this door sheet metal had a diving line at the bottom of it and very highly surfaced side sections with very pronounced radiuses as well as fillets on the doors. While challenging, the designers were able to successfully integrate Buick's bullet nose front fenders and front-end sheet metal, as well as a particularly tasteful rear end with a very flat trunk resembling the 1961 full-size cars. If nothing else, these 1961 Buicks would be particularly handsome. As previously mentioned, under hood in the 1961 Special and Skylark was an all-new 215 cubic inch aluminum block V8 engine. This was really General Motors' first foray into using aluminum on a V8 engine. And although other companies, including American Motors and Chrysler, would introduce aluminum block inline sixes during the 1961 model year, it was just GM that would have this in the V8 lineup across the industry for 1961. GM employed aluminum principally for weight reduction and to allow these vehicles to have great horsepower to weight ratios and also make sure that the front ends weren't especially nose heavy. It did accomplish this goal with these engines, and in fact, the 215 cubic inch V8 was notably lighter than Pontiac's trophy four-cylinder engine, the half of Pontiac's 389, which was an all-cast iron engine. In addition to the block, a number of other parts on the engine were aluminum, including the cylinder heads, the intake, the water pump cover, pistons, the timing chain cover, and it was Buick's first application of a so-called Armasteel crankshaft in its engine. Oldsmobile would also offer this engine under hood, although it was produced with different cylinder heads and pistons, as well as intake manifolds in its F85 and Cutlass lineup, as well as the Jetfire, which had a turbocharged version of the 215 cubic inch V8 with methanol injection. But we'll talk about that particular application later. All specials came standard with a 3-speed manual sourced from Borg-Warner transmission, but most everyone went for Buick's dual-path turbine drive automatic. The transmission was all new and really just weighed under 100 pounds, even when filled with oil. It also didn't prove to be very durable, perhaps in part because it wasn't liquid-cooled, but instead GM decided to have this transmission be air-cooled, perhaps thinking that its aluminum case would enable it to dissipate heat more regularly than typical GM transmissions. A version of this combined 215 cubic inch V8 and transmission would also find their way under hood in the Tempest in early model years if buyers checked that particular option box, enabling them to have 8-cylinder performance instead of the half of a 389 that was standard under hood. If a buyer went for the Skylark model, they had to pay a base price of about $2,600 over the $2,300 base price for the Buick Special, and got Buick's top-of-the-line model. For this, they got a little bit peppier version of the 215 cubic inch V8 underhood with a 4-barrel carburetor and 10.25 to 1 compression ratio, made 185 horsepower compared to the standard engine's 155 horsepower. This actually made the car scoot along pretty well, and frankly, it did have big car acceleration, and the ride on these vehicles with the 4-coil suspension is remarkably smooth and frankly comparable to big car ride. The interiors are a bit noisier because of the unibody and less sound deadening versus the full-size cars, but anybody who drives one of these in good tune would recognize that they actually do drive quite well and do feel like full-size vehicles. In an interesting twist, the 215 cubic inch V8 that I previously mentioned would end up being sold to Rover by General Motors, and it would be used under hood of Rovers and Range Rovers until the early 2000s. Really was a seminal engine that, as I mentioned, GM sold. And this, I guess, was something that happened to GM. GM also sold its Fireball V6 that was introduced in the 1962 Buick Special that would later form the basis of GM's famous 3800 V6. But that was another one that GM ended up selling to Kaiser Corporation at the time, before later buying it back and stuffing it under hood of a number of various vehicles. In any case, the 1961 Buick Special and Skylark were great-looking senior compacts from the Buick lineup, and unfortunately, while they were good-looking, they really didn't do much to help overall Buick sales, which for 1961 increased to 277,000 units from 254,000 units in 1960. That 277,000 sales figure includes 87,000 Specials and Skylarks. So Buick division was really running on fumes in 1961, and the new Special and Skylark didn't much help. It would take a few more years for Buick to regain its footing in the American market that it once had up until, frankly, the 1957 model year, when it was dethroned from the third-place sales crown by Plymouth with the new forward-look vehicles. In In any case, hope you enjoyed the spotlight on the 1961 Buick Special and Skylark. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.